Buying it to rent?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. Well, we're live on YouTube now, and I just got a message from Antonio that he is in fact coming, but he's on his work computer, so he's trying to download Zoom, might use his phone. But regardless, let's get going here. He should be with us in a couple minutes.
Well,
So,
just Evan, to kind of finish up what I was saying to Mark, that house that I listed and sold right away is an example of what we need in the market.
awesome. Yeah, it
I
sounds
totally
like it.
agree.
Can't build that for 22,000.
But I could build it for a heck of a lot less than 145.
You build them, I'll sell them.
All right. Well, let's do our roll call here. It looks like we've got almost everybody here. We got Mark and Bob and Stephanie. Dennis is here. Jackie's here. Sharon's here in her ex officio capacity. Antonio is not here yet, but he will be. So it looks like today we're only missing Wayne as of right now. We'll see if he gets on, but so I guess as for our first action here, do we have a motion to approve the agenda for today?
So moved.
Or,
Second.
Awesome. All in favor, please say yes.
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 All opposed, please say no. All abstaining. All right, that passes unanimously. So we have our public comment session. Comments may not exceed 3 minutes per person. Do we have anybody here for public comment, Sean?
We do not.
Great. All right, thank you. So as for new business, our first item, we need to approve the minutes from the September 8th, 2020 Ad hoc Housing Committee meeting. Do we have a motion?
I'll move we approve those minutes of September 8th.
Thanks, Bob.
Support, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis. All in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All opposed, please say no. All abstaining. That also passes unanimously. Item number 2 under new business, we have a brief presentation from David Stensis. Dave, thanks for being here. Dave's one of our planners, and he's going to be talking to us about the Marquette Land Development Code.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So the city has, in our community development department, has one full-time planner, and that's me. I'm a city planner and zoning administrator. I've been here in this job for 10 years, and just by way to get to know me a little bit, because I've been the main city staff liaison to the Planning Commission and worked with them on our master plan updates, which are significant in 2015, 2018. And when I came here, we were on the tail end of a failed land development code project that was then pushed back on the back burner while we went back into getting our plan, our master plan for the city up to date. It had been pretty out of date. And that process of creating our master plan in 2015 was very significant. The Planning Commission went through a very detailed, spent months of time in the basement of City Hall, gathered around maps, looking at all the parcels in the city, the zoning on the parcels. And I'll get more into that, but planning comes before zoning. That's one of the things I'm going to emphasize over and over again here, as long as we're talking. And just a little more, I came into this job with a background in transportation planning. And if you know anything about city planning, transportation and land use are locked hand in hand, and one leads the other. But if you can tell me which, you probably know more than me. But I've had a lot of other experiences in the working world as a scientist. I worked 10 years in construction, putting myself through college. I've built a lot of houses. I also have a perspective about this topic from the point of somebody who probably lived in substandard housing for 20 years as a young adult, you know, who needed needed affordable housing. And, you know, I was even at the brink of homelessness one time, you know, and I've lived in big cities, medium cities. I've been in 13 other countries and seen everything from people living nomadically to, you know, the nicest stuff in the world. So to the document that I prepared, as you see, it begins with Dennis included some stuff in this agenda that I'm not going to address right away. I want to get to this document that deals with the community master plan's recommendations on housing. Again, planning informs zoning. So we start with a series of recommendations in this plan that deal with all different topics. I'm not going to get into the specifics here because you have the document you can read for yourselves. In 2018, we adopted an update to the master plan, though, that on the bottom of this first page, you'll see Appendix J of our community master plan has a specific reference to housing affordability. And the Planning Commission got into a lot of discussion about housing affordability in 2016, 2017, as they were working through the process of creating an ordinance to deal with, a zoning ordinance to deal with the short-term rentals that were becoming an issue that needed to be addressed. So there's very specific guidance in here about housing affordability and affordable housing, two different topics it kind of calls out here.
Are you referring to? You're looking at the Market Land Development Code, correct?
No, this is the community master plan. So there's a 3-page document that was sent out last week as an addendum to the agenda.
Got it.
That I sent to everybody. On the second page of that at the top, now this is straight out of the master plan. These are recommendations that are verbatim from that I heard at a conference I went to, a state planning conference, from the CEO of the Florida Housing Coalition. And again, I'm not going to repeat these, you have it in front of you. So there's some very specific recommendations there about how to achieve this. But of course, this is, I mean, we're talking about a very complex topic that just about everybody in the country, municipalities, are trying to address in one way or another. So from that planning work, the Planning Commission in the Land Development Code project set out to create some updated code provisions to address affordable housing. Also, though, to address flexibility in using residential property. We were working with an old bandaged code that had been around since the 1970s, and it really had a lot of code provisions, standards that were very hard for a typical homeowner to work with. And you know, I'll get into what really I think the big impacts of the Land Development Code have been to date. The biggest thing that probably, in terms of creating more housing opportunities, is the creation of mixed-use zoning districts. So we used to have a district called the office district. That went away and was replaced with mixed use, but mixed use also then included several districts that were formerly only commercial or formerly only residential. And it was a very targeted approach to create these mixed use zones in nodes and corridors where we've seen residential or commercial development into residential areas and a need for more commercial development around residential and a need for more residential areas. So the former hospital property was one designated for mixed use, as well as these nodes and corridors like McClellan Avenue, Wright Street, Presque Isle Avenue. There are some other nodes, like I said, the former hospital, the former Engine Works property on North Lakeshore Boulevard, the 505 Lakeshore building across from McCarty's Cove, which actually was built in 1912 and has like 14, 15 businesses in it and a residence upstairs. That alone has created a lot of opportunities for people to create housing where it wasn't available previously. And the planning process continues to look at all the parcels in the city and identify parcels where more mixed use may be appropriate in the future. So right now there's in the master plan on our future land use map, there is some identified parcels that have not yet been rezoned, but if the property owner came forward and said, I'd like to use this property to do a corner store or to build a 6-plex apartment building, can I do that? And the answer would be yes, because in that land use map, it's identified for future mixed use. The other thing that was done was the lot standards were radically changed, in particularly single family zoning districts. We used to have a suburban 70-foot frontage standard for the medium density residential district, which was reduced to 37.5 feet. And similarly, the low density districts like the Shiras Hills and Harbor Hills districts, those were reduced from 100 to, or from 80 to 60 feet. We've already seen several people split parcels to create new homes on those smaller parcels. The intent was with a 37.5-foot parcel, you can build a pretty small but adequate house for a family. There are several 40-foot lots in the South Marquette area. Of course, a lot of the city was originally platted at 25 feet and people assembled what they could afford or wanted to build on from those. But there were also lots that were platted at 40 feet. And in some parts of South Marquette, as I said, and around downtown, there are several lots like that. I'm sure people have seen these. How is that legal with these houses that are, kind of pouring over it? It almost seems like the lot lines. But other things were in the land development code that are, the code's a living document. We're planning commission's in the process of updating it now, and we're going to see a public hearing on amendments to it very soon, and at the city commission level, either by the end of the year or the beginning of 21. But reducing the setbacks for these districts, as well as not just the lot size, but significantly reducing or increasing the buildable area. Open space requirements were somewhat reduced, and allowing accessory dwelling units. On-site parking standards have been reduced, particularly for larger developments. That is an ongoing thing too. And that's another thing that's being reduced even further in our updates that are coming. And the lot size standards for duplexes were reduced significantly from 9,000 to 6,000 square feet. The lot sizes were reduced from 75 to 50. The open space requirements were reduced on those lots. One of the, I've looked at the zoning reform examples that have been provided for this meeting, and they are very interesting. There's some really good ideas in there, and I hope we can talk about those a little more. What we do here in Marquette is got to work for Marquette. I think that's important for everybody to remember that there's great examples, and I would hope to look at more than one example of what people are doing elsewhere, and maybe an example that's not necessarily by the Congress for New Urbanism. Not that there's anything, I completely support the Congress of New Urbanism. They've had a huge impact on making places better to live around the country, but they don't have a monopoly on ideas on how to create better places to live. And their ideas aren't necessarily going to translate to Marquette, because I think it's important to remember that things generally happen incrementally because people are only willing to accept incremental changes. And that we're pushing more things forward for loosening some of the restrictions. As I said, some of the updates to the land development code include some changes in our site plan standards that are fairly significant for allowing more work on multifamily residential to be done without site plan review by the Planning Commission and without even site plan review. We're including provisions to allow for small changes to be done through zoning compliance permits. We're continuing to try to take some of the requirements away from the Planning Commission and putting more into administrative approvals, because we basically, as administrators, have to review all of those things that go to the Planning Commission and provide them with an analysis of how those things comport with our codes. And what happens when things go to the Planning Commission is basically the additive thing is public hearings.
Hey, Dennis, can I just?
Dave.
Sounds like we're getting some feedback.
Mark, I had to mute. It was giving some real bad feedback there. Shoot. Hey, Mark, we can't hear you. One second. All right, you're gonna have to hit *6 on your phone. All right,
Okay. Oh, so you muted the phone.
Yeah, we're getting some real bad feedback. I'm not the only one getting that, right?
Yeah, I get it.
Nope.
Is your YouTube channel not muted?
Hold on. Is that any better there?
That didn't echo.
Oh, you just hung it up.
Ain't technology fun?
Bart, do you maybe, if we can't get this to work, do you maybe want to ask something in the chat on Zoom, and then I could read it, or somebody could read it, and we could get a response from David.
Here, try unmuting your iPad.
How's that?
That's good. Can you
Okay,
hear us?
all right, good. I think they had some other Bluetooth going in here. So Dave, basically, I wanted you to expand a little bit more on the site plan review. And I'm just throwing this out as an example. Like, I'm looking at potentially adding 20 units down at the Sugarloaf Villas maybe next year. So the engineers are telling me I have to engineer, or I have to survey every structure that's currently on the property, and then do the design work on this 20 units. And due to the city requirements, it's about $56,000 to do that. And I actually sent that out to bid. And that's, doing the design work on the building, doing the site plan. Now, if I put the same building in Iron Mountain, it's $15,000. So
I'm not sure why you need to resurvey buildings that have actually been surveyed already.
No. So like all the old A-frame buildings that are down there.
Right.
So they want to know every little thing that's on the property. And it's just, those are typical things that are driving up expenses.
Mm-hmm.
So, I can see where they'd want the roads and the egress, but to know where every little corner is, I'm just putting that out there. And it kind of sounds like you guys are looking at having more flexibility, which is what I think is great. And what I've always said is needed, is to give you guys more discretion.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're gonna bring your costs down a lot for something like that. But then again, that project, if you're, I know what you need to prepare a plan that has existing and then proposed development. So the existing development, whether or not they want to, they want to get down to an inch on where those existing buildings are. I don't know that that's necessary so much as showing approximate locations of where those buildings are.
So maybe that's another facet that could be added.
Yeah. I don't think we're sticklers on that kind of a thing to start with. Every project we do have the ability to waive some of the requirements. So for a project like that, I would say that, that there is some flexibility.
So just throwing it out there, like UP Engineers and Architects says they have to survey in the corner of every building and every stoop to meet your requirements.
Well, we could talk about that off the meeting, but
yeah, I'm just
and generally
kind of using the examples of the things that make it more difficult.
Right.
I think that's really helpful feedback, Mark, and yeah, I think that could be a good discussion that we can have continuing forward after this meeting. I just wanted to see, Dave, did you have a couple other points you wanted to cover, or because I think we can circle back on questions and answers for Dave, but we do have Dave Allen here as one of our guests. I just want to be respectful of his time as well.
Right. The only other thing I'd say is I know where things are headed with ADUs, and Planning Commission wants to loosen some of the restrictions for ADUs. And as far as when we're talking about, there are a lot of existing duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes in our single family zoning districts. That's one thing that I think the PowerPoint that was put together doesn't kind of recognize, is there's a lot of existing legal non-conforming multifamily in single family districts and in other districts. But to get to the creation of duplexes by right is something that's probably not a big deal. When we're talking about other more intensive, more dense housing, that's a bigger community conversation. And I think even duplexes is a bigger community conversation. And that is because, you know, back in the 70s, I think the community loosened the restrictions on how many people can live in a duplex, unrelated adults. And this is a college town, so people started capitalizing on that. And it's created a lot of tension in a lot of neighborhoods with duplexes that aren't well managed. And parking is always going to be a big deal in Marquette because we have a winter parking ban for 6 months where you can't park on the street overnight. And it's one of our biggest kind of conundrums that's wicked problems. We have to have a conversation about allowing one car to park in a front yard during the winter parking ban. I think if we're going to also have the conversation about duplexes by right in all the single family districts or other multifamily in single family districts. And with that, I'll say I'm done for now.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, definitely want to get that feedback and input as well. And, you know, folks can ask questions later on in the meeting when we're discussing the PowerPoint you're referencing. And yeah, you're absolutely right. There are those pre-existing uses. You know, I think the PowerPoint's talking more about kind of changes or new developments, but definitely really appreciate that info and all the work that you and the Planning Commission have done to make a lot of progress to get where we are right now. So with that, we have David Allen here with us. He was on the City Council in Grand Rapids and was a key member of the Grand Rapids Housing Advisory Committee, which was very much like our committee. It made 13 recommendations to the City of Grand Rapids, I believe 12 of which have been adopted at this point. You know, so he also has a lot of experience in development as well. So, you know, I'll turn it over to you, David, and you can kind of tell us a little bit about what your experience was in Grand Rapids and some of the things you all did, some of the positive impacts you've seen, some of the challenges you faced.
Sure, thanks. Right now I'm sitting in a hotel room in Jackson, Michigan. We're doing a house here in Jackson on a lake. So this is not my normal background. So very briefly, my background, I've got a 25-year history of doing community development and real estate development. I founded a nonprofit housing organization in Grand Rapids called Lighthouse Communities. Now it's called Link. We did some really creative stuff under that umbrella. I think about 500 units of housing over a 10-year period. And then I was the executive director, the first executive director and the only executive director of the Kent County Land Bank Authority, our land bank in Kent County. Under that heading, did about another 600 houses. We commissioned Michigan State University's Land Policy Institute to do a quantitative and qualitative study of our work, and they found that we created about $57 million in economic development in Kent County that otherwise wouldn't have existed through our work. Everything we did was through creative partnerships. And that's really always been kind of the hallmark of everything I've done. I've never done it in a silo. I've always done it in community and with community. And you know, frankly, have bucked the status quo. I could tell you story after story about that. So when I became a city commissioner, it was kind of a strange circumstance. At the time, I lived in the 3rd Ward of Grand Rapids and was the head of the Kent County Land Bank Authority. A lot of what we did was controversial, but it was controversial only not from the neighborhood perspective and not from the city perspective, but from the investor perspective. A lot of the investors who were snapping up cheap properties and not maintaining them, or were recycling them through the auction process, really took a licking with what we were doing. So, sometimes I think if you're not creating enemies in certain areas or creating a controversy, you're not really creating change. So I accept that controversy. As a city commissioner, I came to it with a different perspective. There was nobody running for the 3rd Ward at all, and they needed a commissioner, and I was asked by several people to run, and so I did. So with that in mind, you know, being a city commissioner that had that much experience with housing put me right at the forefront of during my time as a city commissioner with all the various housing issues that we were dealing with in Grand Rapids, and they're not too dissimilar to what you're dealing with in Marquette. At its peak, our housing shortage was beyond the pale. The greater Grand Rapids area saw the greatest increase in sales price of housing from where it was to where it went in the United States of America. We had the lowest amount of inventory. So I see, Stephanie, you're a real estate agent, so you understand this. You gauge the health of the real estate market by days of inventory on the market. And a healthy market will have about 3 months worth of inventory on the market. We had about 6 hours worth of inventory on the market. So similar to your story you shared earlier, Stephanie, you know, a house would go on the market, it'd sell for 30 or 40 over asking price, and you'd have multiple offers within an hour of it being listed. Who misses out on that is, and just the story that you all are talking about, who misses out on that is the people that are in the middle to the lower rung of the income brackets, because they can't compete. So, you know, you can afford here, the price has gone to here. So now what you can afford, you have to go down to another rung or another rung, another rung. One of the interesting phenomena that we had was we had a lot of longtime rental property owners realizing I could do better just selling this thing and cashing out. So a lot of people were being displaced. There was a huge migration of folks out of Grand Rapids. So with that, the mayor put together a task force that was comprised of 3 city commissioners, me being one of them, and then a whole host of nonprofit, for-profit, bankers, lawyers, community advocacy groups. I mean, it was a pretty broad table, and we looked at what could be done to create more housing at all, and we didn't just focus on affordable housing at all levels. Some of the recommendations you could, I think Evan might send you folks a link to the Housing Now recommendations. Some of them went through, they weren't controversial, it wasn't a big deal, and I'll come back and touch on a couple of those. But the zoning changes received massive pushback. And where that started was there's a strong presence of neighborhood associations in Grand Rapids. And frankly, this is my opinion. So at a meeting, the planning director used the words build by right in talking about attached single family. So one of the zoning recommendations was to allow for attached single family homes, which is basically 0 lot line homes on certain lots to be built just by pulling a permit. So if the lot meets these criteria, you can go in and pull a permit and build a duplex on there. We at the land bank actually built some of the first ones of those in Grand Rapids. So the way it is you build a duplex. When you buy the one side, the demising wall between the 2 properties is your property line, and then there's a master easement over the entire development. And so what that does is allows you to create, Mark alluded to this, it allows you to create without having to go through a lot of expense to put an application together and go for a zoning permit and get a lot of NIMBYism. And so so when the folks in the neighborhood associations heard that word by right, oh my goodness, I started receiving text. I wasn't in the meeting, but I started receiving texts from people in the meeting because they all had my cell phone number saying they're going to build a McDonald's next to my house. I'm like, that's not what it says. You know, so a lot of these changes come down to language. If they would have said build by permit under these criteria, I don't think people would have had such a hard time. But the language that was used was so strong that it really created a lot of problems and a lot of controversy. Same thing with the expansion of ADUs. The folks from the planning that were meeting with the community was saying, you know, build by right. That was a big concern. The other thing that caused a bit of controversy was there was a strong pushback, and I understand why, but there was a very strong pushback from a lot of the nonprofits, a lot of the housing advocacy groups saying there was not enough emphasis on affordable housing, and they felt like some of the changes were going to open Pandora's box for developers just to come in and just take over and not have any concern about affordability. Much of that was unfounded, but if you're a nonprofit and you base your success on advocating for affordable housing, you're going to do that. It's the nature of what you do. So some of the recommendations that I felt were, you know, important, especially as it relates to the zoning changes, were the ones that took the longest. Some of them took over a year to implement and were changed and watered down, in my opinion. So, I think that the zero lot line is one that was has a good potential to create a lot of affordable housing. The one recommendation that I feel has the most potential in Grand Rapids, and that has not, to my knowledge, been executed on, was the city commission passed an ordinance or a declaration, however the legal term is, that allowed the city to purchase land for future use for affordable housing. What I pushed for that pretty hard, because the city of Grand Rapids is pretty financially solvent. Well, pre-COVID, was pretty solvent, had a lot of ability through bond capacity and other capacity to raise dollars. And I felt that, not to be colloquial, but, my dad used to say, you could tell what's important by looking at your checkbook and what you spend money on. So if the city really believed in affordable housing, I felt like it needed to put its money where its mouth is. And so in Grand Rapids, and I've been to Marquette several times, and it's not too dissimilar in Marquette. In Grand Rapids, you have a street, if you've ever been, there's a street called 28th Street. It's the longest contiguous stretch of commercial property in the United States of America. It runs through like 6 cities. In Grand Rapids, there's entire swaths of that. We all know what's going on in the industry. Big box stores are going under. And so there's huge acreage along 28th Street that's just sitting there vacant. In my opinion, the city passed the ability of an ordinance to use city funding to purchase to purchase property for affordable housing. Me and several other commissioners chose 3 areas, one in each ward, that we encouraged the city to work on securing land. And then they could do an RFP for future development, have some for-profit and some nonprofit developers get creative. There was even, Dave, you might be interested in this. There was even a recommendation, it failed, but it was a recommendation in one of these areas, allow it to be kind of an experimental, no zoning requirements, like allow developers in the city to just do it, try like a tiny house village or try various things. I mean, that failed, of course, a little bit too out there, but yeah, I mean, all in all, I think it's, if you go on the city's website, it gives how much production has increased because of some of these recommendations, how much production has increased with for-profits and nonprofits. So all in all, we were limited by state law as far as affordability requirements for development. You can't require developers to, this has been a long time and the words escape me, but the state law prohibits municipalities to require a certain percentage of properties to be affordable. But there are some creative ways around that as well. If the city approves a TIF or if they approve a brownfield, then the city can, in fact, enforce those affordability requirements through the award of those grants. So all in all, I think it's been a mildly successful. I think it could have been more successful if it would have been embraced by everybody. And I think that even more education up front to the community would have been helpful about. So I'll give you a great example. And it's on the city's Housing Now website. In May of 2020, just this past May, they commissioned a housing study. A gentleman by the name of Ryan Kilpatrick did it. I know Ryan quite well. It's an amazing piece of work because it shows the total housing need in Grand Rapids, not just it's market rate, high end, middle end, missing middle, low end, and there's needs on every end of the strata. I think if they would have done that first, then some of the other recommendations they could have done would have been a lot more supported because they were supported with data about the need for housing. So that's, I think, a lesson learned. I think, man, I got off commission. They were still working through some of the Housing Now. I got off commission in 2017. I got off the commission. And just 3 years later, they commissioned the study, which should have been done 3 years before that. So I would encourage you to go on that website, look at the feedback, look at the reports that they're giving to the community. They're very helpful. So that's my experience. What we're doing now, when the land bank shut down, we were working with the state land bank extensively around the state. That's how I started working with Angelo up in Marquette on using modular construction to help solve some of these missing middle needs. So we launched a Nova Lab development group as a standalone entity, and our mission now is to work with municipalities, nonprofits, for-profits, land banks around the state to create missing middle housing strictly using modular construction. So that's kind of my focus right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate it. I don't know, does anybody have any, questions for Dave about, really anything that he was talking about here, about what they did in Grand Rapids?
I guess I have one question. I would just be curious to know what the housing situation is like now, and which of the policies that you guys adopted that you think might have impacted that change the most.
The housing market right now in Grand Rapids is the same. It hasn't changed. It's still there. Anecdotally, my daughter and her husband just bought a house, and they're selling a house. They bought and sold the house in the same day. It's so anecdotally it hasn't really changed. I think the one that's there has been a significant uptick in affordable rental development, and I think some of the policies that they put together, and they're detailed on the Housing Now website. I think those policies, allowing density bonuses for small scale development, a few of those developments, I think developers learn pretty quick, Jackie. So so the for-profit and these for-profit developers aren't a bunch of, I know many of them personally, and I know their hearts. They really care about what they're doing, and they're not crummy landlords or building crummy properties. They're building some of the best properties in Grand Rapids. So when they know what the playing field is, they go after it pretty aggressively. And I think the density bonus, the affordability requirements, some of those I think were probably the most, and the zero lot line. There's a lot of those being built in Grand Rapids right now. So instead of getting one house on a lot, you're getting two, or instead of two houses on two lots, you're getting four. I think those are the ones that are having the greatest impact.
What do you think they should have done if you were king for the day?
Been more aggressive and not back down to public pressure. And as I stated earlier, the housing needs study that they commissioned in 2020 should have been commissioned simultaneous or before the commission was put together. It only took Ryan like 6 months to put it together, and it's an incredibly well-written piece of work. So I think that should have been done to establish the baseline.
Do you think that you got negative public pressure because people weren't understanding what you were trying to do, or because they didn't like what you were trying to do?
I think it's misconception about what we're trying to do. I think that and there's a lot of mistrust amongst some of the grassroots organizers against the big time developers, so they viewed them as the enemy. And so anything that they felt might tip the scales towards them created a real strong public outcry. And I think at the beginning, some kind of even if it was one session to say, hey, let the developers talk, share from their heart. Here's what I do. Here's what I build. Here's why I build it. And then let the developers hear from the community, just to kind of establish, they were all just thrown in a room with no sense of community building or anything like that. So, the process we went through to develop the 13 recommendations was a really good process. It was facilitated well. We've all been through these, but you have your idea, and then your sub ideas, and then you take your little red dots and you vote the ideas. And so, I think it was about 30 recommendations that was boiled down to 12 that were the top 12 that they did. So I think it was a need for more education, a little bit of community building up front, and then just better explanation of the process.
I have one quick question. When you're talking about the city purchasing land for affordable housing, would the city then sell the land to the developers, or would the city retain ownership of the land and effectively be a landlord? How did you imagine that going?
Sean, I think every project can and should be the entity or the process for the disposition of that land it is its own individual project. So let me give you a great example. So the city of West Branch purchased 32 acres, and they just said, so they went to the market and said, hey, market, come buy these 32 acres from us and build houses. Well, the markets in that area is just not building houses yet. The market can absorb or can sustain houses. And what they're looking for is not affordable housing, with that missing middle, workforce housing. They've got a lot of industry there where employees have to work, are getting houses an hour and a half away from work. So what the city of West Branch approached us at Innova Lab, we operate under two different entities. One is a L3C, which is a limited profit corporation. And so what we're developing is a joint development agreement between Innova Lab, the city of West Branch, and their county's land bank. And what we're doing is the land comes into the development agreement, and then we back into a number, Sean, that when the houses are, when it's parceled and the city's working on parceling it out and doing all that work. So as we start to build houses on these lots, there's a set number on the cost of land to help reimburse the city for their cost of the acquisition and the infrastructure. So the city's participating by leveraging. As a developer, I come in and I'm super happy because I don't have to go through the expense of hiring hiring somebody to do the planning and the surveying and all that kind of stuff. The city's doing that on their dime, and they'll recoup that. And they said, if we don't recoup it all, but recoup some, that's okay for them, because we're going to create about 100 units of housing on that 32 acres. That's just one creative way. I mean, every way, Sean, I just would encourage any city to say, what can we do to leverage our position to help create more housing? And that's determined on a site-by-site basis.
And doesn't that kind of dovetail with what David was saying from the community master plan that he shared in some of the things that could have to happen to make things work? That sounds exactly like what he was talking about as well.
Yes, most definitely.
Appendix J.
Yes, most definitely.
Do we have any other questions folks have? All right, well, if not, I just really want to thank you, Dave, for taking some time out of your day to talk to us. And, I think that we'll definitely benefit a lot from your experience and what you were sharing with us today. And as you noted, I will be sending out the link to the Grand Rapids webpage where folks in the committee here can learn more about the specific recommendations that the Housing Advisory Committee made in Grand Rapids, so we can review that and maybe have a discussion about it at our November meeting.
Sounds good.
I think that would be another good example. I think Dave sent us to your point of we need to bring in different examples to compare and contrast. I think that would be another good one to bring in. So.
Great. So I appreciate being here, and I applaud you in your commitment and your work to this. It's very important. So I'm going to go swing a hammer for a while. All right. Have a good day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. All
right. Well, yeah, with that, thank you all for the questions. That was excellent. Moving on, we are going to, I think we can continue I think I'm going to leave it up to all of you. So on the agenda, new business item number 4 is just a discussion about zoning and affordable housing. And then new business item number 5 is a brief presentation that Antonio and I put together, and we're gonna present to all of you about missing middle housing. We basically went on a little walking tour around the city, took some pictures. We looked at the Vermont Congress for New Urbanism report and compared that to some of our zoning in the city as well. So anyway, my thought was maybe it would be more helpful for us to just run through that presentation real quick, and then we can take the remainder of our time for questions, answers, and discussion.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen real quick then. All right. Go to. All right. Antonio and me, we went for a little walk this weekend around East and Central Marquette because we thought that would be where we would find the most examples of missing middle housing. So I think just as a brief overview, and it's certainly, a complex topic, but I really like this graphic that was created by this firm called Opticos Design, where to kind of describe visually where missing middle housing falls in the spectrum of, housing and density. I mean, everything from duplexes up to, kind of medium-sized apartment buildings could all be considered missing middle housing. And I like this quote as a definition. Missing middle housing is a range of house scale buildings with multiple units compatible in scale and form with detached single family homes located in a walkable neighborhood. And that's the definition that was created by Daniel Perolek, who we may actually have coming to present to us in December. And he's actually the person that coined the phrase missing middle housing. So Antonio, I don't know if you want to kind of take it away and describe to folks some of the things that we saw in Marquette.
Sure. I think here I'll preface and set the stage. Thanks, Evan, for going on this tour. We want to just point a few things out. Number one, we don't know who owns these buildings. We're not advocating for a specific set or subset of a standard. We're working with the Land Development Code Master Plan to kind of think of new ways or ways that we want to approach the management, the community pressures, the parking, the setbacks, and all that good stuff that we'll get into in the next few meetings. But number one, this is a really good example here right off of Lincoln, I believe, around Harrison Street in the neighborhood. It's a low density example. We have 3 or 4 minimal setback standard buildings. Looks like just from the age, they were probably built sometime in the 50s or so, maybe after that. So not maybe even 70s, it depends on where you're looking at. But here, what is striking to me is that there is no setback, very minimal. Evan, looks like 5-10 feet max, but they're so compact. They are maybe what some would bring as starter homes. Maybe some would call them rental income properties. Maybe some of these could even be wide enough or deep enough to have several units in them that are obviously to standard. So we're going to go ahead and just jump through these. Feel free to ask questions right now or maybe save them to the end, but we want to give some time for discussion. So maybe I'll just run through them. Thanks. ADUs are very interesting, and that's probably, we could take up a whole hour just talking about the specifics of each one. Evan and I were unsuccessful in finding an ADU on the walking tour, meaning to say that maybe there are some in the city of Marquette that we could highlight as an example and maybe do a mini case study. But these two here really call out the fact that the lots on these are probably a bit bigger in where they are located. I think this is the east side of Ridge Street towards Arch, between the Lakeshore and Front Street. So that whole corridor probably does not have typical 37.5 by 125, 150. They're a little bit bigger in size. So here, 2 garages clearly with a driveway, a few cars you could see, but we thought that this was an interesting example of potentially a cottage home or a single family with maybe some parking on the side yard, which you can't appreciate in this photo, but these 2 of these houses have massive side yards that are just grass right now. We can get into that too with the snow and issues that we may see with parking. Next one. This is a classic example, actually, at Michigan's historic designation. What is another ADU potentially, or just single family? It's hard to say, but you have a driveway again with a nice landscaping, and all the way towards the back, you have what looks like the original home. So, there may be some history here or some non-conforming standards, but for the most part, it shows you that a home does not have to be this humongous, complex. This could also house a single family or the like. Next slide, please.
The first one didn't fall, so I put in another $1.
Give the second one, and then I thought I want to get my granddaughter a pack.
We're getting some background noise. Sorry, duplexes here. This is something that I think we should probably spend a little more time talking about in general within the committee. One of the examples that showed in the book that Evan referenced and a few other resources, that duplexes allow obviously for two families to be set up in what would be considered a modest single family residence. We did see a few examples of this, quite notably. I don't think there's, here's three more. I don't think that we were on an escapade or of sorts to try to identify as many as we could, nor do we know, and that's another example of a question that I'll have post this presentation, is just getting some raw data on how many of these are city tracked, or there's a data bank where we could find out to the point of the Grand Rapids example, maybe if there's a way to figure out, what housing is needed, et cetera. This is another good example. Clearly, just right by the library, you don't have to walk too far outside of downtown. You have two beautiful historic homes on your right. They are considered duplex, I do believe. The one on the left is a standard size, maybe brick, converted home. I think maybe originally it was apartments, maybe it still continues to be that. But one thing we wanted to note is we're going to have rental discussions, we're going to have condo discussions, we're going to have regular housing and mortgage backed, style purchasing here. So I think we have to kind of think about it as also, how do we make it work so that there are multiple, avenues, not necessarily just one building is rental, one building is all condos. We'll get into that discussion as well. How about you take this one, Evan? This one's a really interesting one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Antonio. So this is kind of an interesting case study into what eventually, you could see in more places in Marquette. This is almost kind of like a little duplex court kind of concept, where you have a historic church, a historic large single family home that was owned by a lawyer, for many years. And then in the back, there's an accessory dwelling, and that used to be a single family home. And all three of them have been converted to duplexes and are rented at, pretty reasonable rates that would be affordable for middle income households. And I know that because I actually used to live in the building on the right when I was in school, and I was growing up here in Marquette. So this is, I think, an interesting example where, you've got, three buildings, 6 units. They're in easy walking distance of downtown, relatively affordable. This would be a classic example of some kind of creative missing middle housing.
Okay, going on to 3rd Street. As we know, there is a corridor for businesses. One example we found is Contrast Coffee Company on the upstairs. Looks like they had 3 additional apartment units. So you can kind of appreciate there that they've added a balcony, and I think one thing that I wanted to note as we discuss is just maybe from a community standpoint is trends that we are seeing here in Marquette. It's a college town. It's always been a college town in some sectors. There's rentals for housing for students, but there's also a few other populations that wouldn't mind, maybe living in a situation like this. I think we kind of have to think outside the box where, everybody wants a single family home. Potentially everybody wants to have, their own backyard. A lot of the commutes, that, and even in times of COVID with remote working, there's national studies and national data and research that show that there is no one place, one size fits all when it comes to identifying the type of urban living and walkable spaces that people wouldn't mind or wanted to be, a part of. So we can have that discussion later, but I thought that was an interesting point here with Superior Culture. You could see on the left side, if you could appreciate that door, it says private residence. So clearly they have a system of management potential here in this building where I think, Dave, you've alluded to this as well. Maybe there are some some housing examples that are mismanaged in the city. You're going to have that, I think, but we have to be able to enact some of those standards so that people are responsible, are maintaining their yards, are, enforcing parking. On the right is 3 businesses with some rentals or maybe even office spaces on the top. I think this is a good example of just the community taking that corridor, which was, I think, traditionally a business corridor, and making it where they're adding units on the top. Next slide, please. We'll kind of get into this a little bit more. Here are 2 examples of triplexes with parking in the rear. Again, you have bigger lots. I think the one on the left is a newer triplex. And Evan, I think he brought up the example that currently they may be prohibited in low density, medium density residential districts, which covers quite the majority of in-town housing types.
Yeah, and I think also, just to add on to that, as Dave noted, there are pre-existing uses that are allowed. So like this is newer, but like I don't know the exact story behind this property, because this one on the left here is actually zoned medium density residential. So perhaps there was a pre-existing use, but there was like some very intensive renovation at the very least, and like looked like bordering on new construction going on there throughout the summer this year. And then the one on the right here is zoned multifamily residential.
Yeah, if you look at the block in general, we didn't do a good job highlighting what's next to there. But you can always see that traditionally, and maybe even so now with design and maybe urban planning, you have a corner of an intersection, whether it's teetering on a business district. Those are probably lots that are going to have a little bit more style when it comes to 3 triplexes, a quad, a duplex, and you can blend that into the community such that you don't have triplexes in the middle of the block. So I think there's a little bit of that conversation to be had and review of what we currently have. Again, not advocating for this, just saying that there are certain ways that you can design this to create a need for a coffee shop, down the street, or maybe, another business or dry goods, etc. So I thought that was really interesting as we were walking around 3rd Street, that there's already all this in place right now. This is another converted home that now houses a 4-plex. And this, I believe, Evan, is within the low density area, and it's located right around Pine and Ridge. So this is a really good example of creating additional units within what's allowed. So. Yeah,
this actually is in the multifamily residential district. The thing I thought was kind of interesting, well, there's 2 reasons I think this example is interesting. Number one, I live here, so this is where I currently live, and it is, I can tell you, like from personal experience, one of the only affordable like 1-bedroom apartments that I could find in Marquette, searching for about 6 months after I graduated from college and knew that I had a job lined up here. And it's still not technically, like, according to our definition that we created of 30% of your household income, it's not affordable for me by any stretch, but I can get by, and then the other thing that I think is interesting about this is that, this is really it was traditionally like a large single family home, and it coexists alongside many traditional single family homes, alongside some duplexes. Across the street is the Pine Ridge, very high density, low income housing complex. And yet these uses all exist within the same neighborhood. And maybe there are some people that have issues, but personally, having lived here for over a year now, I don't think there's substantial problems that are created by that additional density. In fact, I think it actually makes it a more interesting place to live, personally.
I do believe this used to be a 6-plex that they brought down to 4.
Okay, that's interesting. I know that to provide a little more detail, the top floor there what is a unit. Then there's 2 on the back. It's almost like a little duplex. And then currently, right now, the folks that own this place live in the bottom 2 floors in the main part of the structure there. So yeah, that could have been, yeah, like a it could certainly be a 5 or 6 unit building. I guess, historically, when this was originally built, I'm sure it was originally intended as a single family, like one of these historic Victorian single family homes that a very affluent person would have lived in. I'm not aware of the entire history of the property.
Evan, what does the parking situation look like here at this complex?
Yeah, so it's zoned multifamily. So and please correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but basically we are required to have 1.125 parking spaces per dwelling. So there are a couple of off-street parking spaces in a driveway in the front on the Ridge Street side that are basically used by the owners who live in those bottom 2 units and that in the largest unit in the building. And then those of us who live in the smaller unit in the building have 3 off-street parking spaces provided in the larger driveway on Pine Street. And realistically, it is a little tight, but we make it work. When the winter parking ban is not in effect, I pretty much always park on the street, and I think like most of my neighbors do that most of the time as well. So definitely agree that the winter parking ban is a conversation we're going to have at some point because it is so relevant when we're talking about increasing the number of units allowed, parking requirements, things like that all have a major impact on housing supply and housing affordability. It's definitely kind of a unique circumstance that we have here in the city that needs to be considered.
Thank you.
Well, it's a unique because we consider it. There are lots of places that just say no parking and they don't care what you do. So we do take it into consideration. Chicago, you just can't park on one side of the street in the winter and you can fight for a spot.
Yeah, and that is how, from my understanding, that's how it works in most communities that experience heavy snow.
Well, they experience snow. We experience heavy snow.
Well, no, sure. I mean, I guess I'm thinking like for example, in Duluth or like Minneapolis, I think they also have the same policy in place from what I've read. But yeah, I mean, point taken. We definitely have a lot more snow than most of the country.
I'll run through this slide real quickly. And again, these are just my thoughts, just opinion. There's no factual information in here, but something that we thought about as we were walking and we're approaching the dome at that point on 3rd Street is, Evans brought this up with Northern Michigan University students. Who would benefit from the creation of more units? Who would benefit from the overall established code and maybe some modification to it to allow for some of these examples? Well, Northern Michigan University students for sure, graduating, maybe that want to stay around Marquette, the county, UP in general, young working professionals, young couples who may be on the lower entry level job situation that may not have saved enough or to be, going into the housing market, maybe want some rentals. And also low middle income families. And let's not forget, I think, Evan, I keep bringing this up, but we have to think of our seniors that want to downsize from their current home. They may not want to be, removing snow in the middle of a February night. So they're going to have to look for ways to make, everything a little bit more walkable and affordable because they are on stricter budgets. So here are some questions that I kind of want to pose out for the group as we think about these. How many units have been built in the last 5 to 10 years? How many new units have been built? And how many of these have been in that spectrum that we've defined as low income to middle range? What is the demand for new affordable units? And
I do think that some of your question on the seniors and retirees, that housing is being added to right now in Harlow Farms. That's some of what they're building right now. Is that 55 and older?
And that's a good
Yeah,
example.
but that's way out. I mean, that's like not downtown. So they're not walking downtown for services or anything.
Will housing have to be downtown? Or like city center?
I don't think it has to be, but I think if you're all the way out in Harlow Farms, it's hard to interact with the city itself if you're 75, 85 years old. That's all I'm
Well,
saying.
that's the same as Lost Creek is out there too, but that's where the land was.
Yeah,
No, I
and
understand that. I'm just saying, you know, we can't really just say, okay, we've already got that because it's out in Harlow Farms and somebody's going to make some money off of that.
I think, Dennis, I think you raise a valid point, and I think that when we looked at that definition of missing middle housing earlier, that walkability component is important. There are, as I think, notes kind of down here, like there may be seniors, and retirees who maybe, they aren't able to drive. And as you noted, if you're 80 years old and you're not able to drive, or at least you don't feel comfortable driving, and you're living out on the edge of town, that could be tough. I mean, I definitely understand your point, Stephanie, if that's where the land is. I think that's why we maybe need to start looking at some of these, some of the restrictions with zoning and density and things like that, to try and create
I don't disagree at all, but I don't want our focus to be primarily on that group. They do have Snowberry, which is, a friend of mine just is moving in this month. So that is a downtown 55 and older, exactly fills that niche. I think we have other niches that have greater need.
Yeah, that's not
Antonio, I
my
wanted
point
to-
though. My point wasn't that was going to be our focus. My point was, I don't want to focus at the outer edges so that somebody that doesn't have a car is essentially into a food desert and
Yeah, just
has to
because it's
rely
out
on
there
somebody
doesn't mean
else.
it's not needed. I get you.
Yeah, Mark, what were you gonna say?
So I want to go back to Antonio and your walking tour. You showed a lot of different converted buildings. I want to be very cautious about that. It's very difficult to legally and safely convert a single family home into a duplex, triplex, or greater. There's numerous different fire codes. Basically, if you build if you were going to convert one of those, every wall, every ceiling would have to be a minimum of a 2-hour rated wall, okay, which is very difficult to achieve. And at a minimum, it's going to be 4 layers of drywall, of 5/8 type X drywall separating you from your neighbor. So converting these old buildings, there's a lot of them that just have been done under the radar, and they're not as safe as new construction. It's not that these converted buildings from years ago aren't safe. The new stuff is safer. But if you're going to take some old building and you have an older gentleman in there that wants to split it and make it a duplex, to legally do it through building codes is not easy by any means, because you're talking walls, ceilings, basements, from floor to ceiling to wall, all has to have a fire rated assembly. So you need to be aware of that. It's doable, but it's extremely expensive to do it legally.
And each unit needs to have a bathroom and a kitchen, which is the most expensive part of a home addition.
Your fire rating would be far more than that in an old building.
Yeah.
I think that's a really valuable point there, Mark. I think, some of these questions, you all have this presentation, so we can review some of these questions and the other material in here, at our leisure and discuss it in November as well, where I hope we can continue this discussion. I guess I would, let's try and run through just in the next couple minutes here real quick, the last couple slides, and then maybe hopefully we can leave, 10, 15 minutes for discussion or questions and answers at the end.
Great.
So I can kind of, just briefly summarize this. There's a lot here, so I'm not going to endeavor to go through this whole thing. And also, I tried to be very meticulous when I was putting this data together from the zoning code. So I'm confident that it's accurate, but if there are inaccuracies, please point that out. I can send out a corrected version. And again, as Dave noted, there are pre-existing uses that are kind of like, for lack of a better term, like grandfathered in as non-conforming, even within some of these districts. This is referring to, like new development, new construction, converting older buildings or building something new. So, but these are just some comparisons between that Vermont/Congress for the New Urbanism report. They had a neighborhood district, which, like, from my understanding from reading the report, was supposed to be kind of like a medium density residential district, and comparing their recommendations for various zoning standards with what we've got in our code right now. And again, this is just one example, but it's something to get us thinking, I think. And then the other thing here is comparing the report's town center district, which is kind of like a mixed use district that's meant to be like kind of centered around a downtown area. Comparing that with like our central business district, our 3rd Street corridor district, and our mixed use district as well. And then they have some recommendations here about accessory dwelling units, which do differ substantially from where we're at on ADUs right now in our zoning code. Although a couple of these changes, I think, the Planning Commission is planning on making. And then our zoning map, again, the language up above, we're talking about, we're not talking about not permitted, non-conforming uses that are being allowed to continue right now. We're talking about new developments, and we're talking about permitted uses and things that aren't allowed by the current code, talking about changes from what existed before the land development code was updated. And that's all I have. I can zoom back and forth between slides too if people have questions, but just want to take these last 10, 12 minutes or so if people have any questions, comments, things they wanted to bring up.
How do you think we can use this information to develop our proposal?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that first of all, as we're developing our proposals, I think that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Certainly we need to consider the unique circumstances that we do have in Marquette, because every community is unique. One thing I thought was kind of interesting about the report that was prepared for the state of Vermont was that Vermont, I've been to Vermont. It's very, very similar to the UP. Many of the towns in Vermont have a very similar development, like New Hampshire and other places like that in northern New England have a very similar development pattern to like Marquette or at some other towns in the UP, and are facing some of the same challenges with housing choice and affordability, as well as some zoning code issues. And so, I thought it was a useful example for us to look at. I think the Grand Rapids recommendations that I'll share out to the committee from what Dave Allen was talking about, those will be useful as well. But I guess to answer your question, Stephanie, the way that I envision, at least that I envision this being helpful, is that we need to look at, we can't reinvent the wheel. We need to look at examples from other places that have been implemented and like recommendations that could apply to us as well.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to address the committee if I could.
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
So on that topic of data and looking at other places, efforts and whatnot, I would suggest that if you really want to know, get your finger on the pulse of what Marquette is maybe ready for, is to do a survey, to conduct an opinion survey. I think, a very short, maybe 5-10 questions. We did a lot of surveying before we updated the master plan in 2015, and it's very useful for, and maybe a public forum. It's harder to do a public forum now, but it's not impossible to do a public forum virtually. But doing some kind of outreach to the community to get their opinions on this, I think, is a really important topic, because you're going to find there's a lot of people that aren't going to necessarily be on the same page. And of course, this committee is educating themselves and probably a lot more aware of trends. But as I said before, making incremental changes is usually, typical in a community. We're talking now about increasing building heights downtown. That's one thing that's going to be, we've had just as an example, we've had a limit there of 60 feet for decades on new building heights. So we're going to be talking, about that. We know there's a lot of very differing opinions on that, even though there's 10 or 12 buildings in the downtown area that exceed that height. There's a lot of people that don't want higher buildings. There's a lot of people that don't want duplexes by right, or I'm not going to use that term anymore, by right, as a permitted use, permit required. But there's a reason that duplexes still have had a special use status. I actually do think we're probably with a case. Just real quick, the Board of Zoning Appeals approved a case that went to them last week for a duplex on a 5,000 square foot lot. That's 4,000 feet less than what was required in the old zoning ordinance. And this case was pretty much a slam dunk because it had been in family ownership since it was built in the 1880s. And it was just a conversion back to, often people that have a duplex, it was built as a duplex, they convert it back to single family for tax advantage, because you get to claim your principal residence exemption as a single family. You don't get that as a duplex, so you pay more in taxes.
Dave, you do get half of it if you live in half.
Yeah, but so you pay less in taxes if it's a single family house. And a lot of people have done that. And that's where we see a lot of people convert duplexes in single family neighborhoods, is they were already duplexes. They just converted them back to single family for the tax advantage. And then they come back and want to do it. Well, Dennis and I have both been talking about this, and we think it's probably, time to lift to take the special use away from duplexes, especially based on this last case that went to the BZA. The problem's always parking. Is there enough parking? Because you have to have those parking spaces for each dwelling unit. And that's where a lot of the problems come up between neighbors, between like the denser development and low density, is there's people creating trouble with, between the properties with parking. So, I'll just say that the opinion survey, I think, would be helpful.
Dave, I'm happy to team up with you, and I love creating surveys. I have some experience with that. I'd be happy to team up with you on doing something for the community outreach portion, even a forum. That sounds really good.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a great recommendation, Dave, and I think you raised some valid points. I think that we need to have a sense of urgency about this problem, because it can get away from us, has gotten away from other communities similar to Marquette if we don't act quickly enough. But at the same time, as you said, we need to make sure that we're thinking about what the community is ready for and prepared to accept, and what are the actual needs of the community. So, right now, I think I mentioned this once or twice before, but I thought it was interesting that Dave Allen mentioned that we should do a housing needs assessment.
Right.
Because right now, QPAD, our regional planning agency, is doing a housing needs assessment for the city of Marquette. And we will probably be getting, I've been talking with QPAD, and we're probably going to get an advanced, draft of that in like November or December for our review that we can then incorporate into our recommendations. But the final report will be released. The final housing needs assessment will be released by QPAD in January as well. So right around the same time, we'll be making our initial report to the commission and our initial recommendations to the commission. So, hopefully there will be some survey data in there. Of course, we have some survey data from the county master plan that's ongoing, but I completely agree that a separate survey to try and gauge what city residents might be ready for and might be willing to accept and what they want would be a really good step to take. So I would be happy to work with you and Antonio and anybody else in that as well. Do we have any other questions, comments, concerns? We just got a couple minutes left here.
And I think that if we do a survey, even just sharing to city residents through our social media channels could be very effective, and requiring an address. We might even get some interesting information from people outside of the city who would like to live in the city.
That's a really good point, Stephanie.
I don't need their name, but if you give me your address, that might be a good tool for us, and I would promote that.
We've just used, are you a city resident or not? Or are you a permanent city resident? Because the students will often answer, you know, we're a resident, but temporary.
Awesome. All right. Well, does anybody have any final questions you'd like to ask anybody, or any final statements or points you wanted to bring up?
Evan, I don't want to sound like a naysayer. I feel like we're getting fantastic information, and I'm really appreciating the information we're getting, but I'm not sure how we're moving towards our goal. And maybe a few more rounds of information, and we'll be able to discuss that goal more cogently.
Yeah.
Does that make
Stephanie,
sense?
yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. You know, our goal right now, so first of all, we lost a lot of time because of COVID. I was trying to, you know, get us to do these virtual meetings a little earlier. They happened when they did. But I think that, you know, right now what we're trying to do is like gather some of this information. I hope that in November we can have a more in-depth discussion about, you know, just preliminarily about what some recommendations, some concrete recommendations might look like, based on some of this missing middle housing and zoning discussion that we've been having, based on some of the information that we're receiving. In December, the plan is that we're going to be looking at obstacles for developers. And so, you know, I've been talking with Lynn Swadley, local developer who's involved with, you know, Harlow Farms and all that stuff, to talk to us, as well as I think most of our December meeting will be consumed with a presentation from a couple of folks. There's a developer named Shannon Morgan who was involved in the Grandview project here in Marquette.
He's fantastic.
Yeah, and she actually like I said, may be able to get Daniel Perolik, or at least somebody from his firm, to come use the old hospital property as a proof of concept for how we could get missing middle housing development and affordable housing development in the city of Marquette, even with very difficult properties like the old hospital. So that will also, I'm sure, have plenty of, you know, specific recommendations for things that we could do. In January, my goal is that, you know, between the December and January meeting, the next couple, those last couple months, we're gonna, you know, our planning staff and like me and like anybody else that wants to help out can start compiling this initial report. And then in January, we can have a very in-depth discussion for the entire meeting about, okay, what do we actually, we'll look at a draft of the report. What do we actually want some recommendations to be? We can, you know, nix recommendations, add some recommendations if we want, and then have a vote on what we want to be in the final report to the initial report to the commission. And I think it's important to keep in mind that we'll continue meeting then for another 6 months and have another report we can make in June, which might be a little more specific and in-depth.
I think that sounds like a real good plan. It gives us some focus in the short term as well as long term. I'm finding just the amount of data and new information that I'm getting is very helpful to me in terms of trying to get my head around this whole process and this whole problem.
Well, thank you, Bob. And Stephanie, to your point, like, I do apologize as the chair. Perhaps I was not providing enough of a vision. You know, I think in addition to sending out the Grand Rapids information as a follow-up, I might send out a rough timeline that I have discussed with Dennis.
I think we've discussed it. I just think that I don't want us to get bogged down in information without action.
Yep, absolutely. I think I agree with you completely. My goal is that we have some actionable recommendations in January and then hopefully more in our June report. Absolutely. Great. Well, with that, I think we are now at 12:01. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Does anybody have any last parting shots here? All right, well, if not, I think we're gonna adjourn this meeting here at 12:02 p.m. And I really want to thank everybody, for participating. And, we'll be meeting again next month and hopefully be able to continue this discussion and really have time without presentations and things like that to just discuss what makes sense and what we think some of our recommendations, at least in this area, might be. So